Ethan Carter had always believed that a home wasn't just a structure, but a sanctuary, a refuge where memories, hard work, and quiet determination came together in perfect harmony. A decorated military veteran turned dedicated city official, Ethan had spent years restoring classic cars in his spare time, meticulously poring over every dent and detail, as if reviving a piece of history. His suburban haven, a modest yet tastefully renovated colonial home, lay on a tree-lined street where each house bore the promise of community and comfort. For Ethan, the property represented more than brick and mortar. It was a legacy of sacrifice, self-reliance, and the hope that his neighbors shared similar values. Late afternoons found him in his garage, a space that doubled as both a workshop and a personal retreat, listening to the hum of his favorite vintage radio while polishing chrome details on his beloved '57 Chevy. Life was predictable and peaceful, until the day Kerren arrived. Kerren, a middle-aged woman with a perfectly coiffed hairdo and a permanent air of superiority, had long ago decided that rules, especially those governed by the Homeowners Association (HOA), were absolute. As the self-appointed queen of the HOA, she presided over her domain with a blend of entitlement and rigid adherence to a set of arbitrarily enforced guidelines. Her title was less an honor and more a burden of power. She had turned neighborhood disputes into personal vendettas. It wasn't unusual to find her hovering outside houses, clipboard in hand, scanning for even the slightest infraction. On a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning, Ethan opened his garage door to retrieve a set of car parts when his eyes widened in disbelief. There, parked conspicuously in the spot reserved for his cherished vintage vehicle, was Kerren's sleek sedan, a car so out of place in his personal sanctuary that it immediately set his nerves on edge. Who parks in someone else's garage? Ethan muttered to himself, heart pounding with indignation. It wasn't just about a misplaced car. It was about a flagrant violation of boundaries. Kerren had taken her authoritarian role too far this time. The first confrontation unfolded in the soft light of dawn. Ethan stepped outside, his work clothes still bearing traces of grease and determination, and faced Kerren standing at her driveway with an unsettling smirk. "Kerren," he said evenly, "this garage isn't a parking lot." His voice, though calm, carried an undercurrent of frustration that hinted at deeper grievances. Kerren's response was a mixture of condescension and satisfaction. "Rules are rules, Ethan," she snapped. "The HOA decided this spot is now common property. It's time you learned to follow the guidelines." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He had known the HOA's overreach for some time, the endless fines for minor infractions, the excessive demands for conformity, and the intimidation tactics that made community living feel like a life under surveillance. To him, it wasn't just a misinterpretation of parking rights. It was another insult to his personal freedom. With a measured tone that belied the storm brewing inside, he replied, "I've always respected community standards, but I never agreed to relinquish my right to use my own property. This isn't about parking, it's about autonomy." Their words echoed in the still morning air as neighbors began to peep out of their windows. Rumors had circulated about Kerren's habitual meddling and the questionable decisions that the HOA board often accepted without scrutiny. Even before any official warnings or fines were issued, Ethan sensed that the seeds of a larger conflict were being sown. The confrontation was not just a clash of personalities. It was a microcosm of the battle between individual rights and institutional overreach. For Ethan, the garage had always been his personal laboratory of dreams, an extension of his identity as both a craftsman and a rebel against conformity. Now, as Kerren's car loomed like an unwanted reminder of bureaucracy, his frustration simmered into resolve. He made a silent promise that day. If the HOA dared to trample on his freedoms again, he would stand up, not just for himself, but for every homeowner whose voice had been stifled by arbitrary rules. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the neighborhood in a warm glow, the stage was set for an escalating drama. The once quiet cul-de-sac was about to transform into a battleground where pride, property rights, and the spirit of independence would be fiercely defended. Ethan's quiet determination met Kerren's pompous entitlement head-on, and neither was willing to back down. The wheels of confrontation had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The morning after the garage incident, Ethan awoke to find an envelope taped to his front door. It was no ordinary notice. It was a formal citation for violating community light and property standards. The crisp, official language detailed a $750 fine and threatened further legal action if he failed to comply with the recently amended HOA guidelines. The timing could not have been worse. Ethan's frustration from the previous day had barely subsided when he was confronted with the first overt act of HOA overreach. Kerren, ever the enforcer of rules, stood on the sidewalk with an unmistakable air of self-satisfaction. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan," she declared, her voice imbued with the certainty of someone who believed that authority was absolute. Despite his own official position in city government, Ethan knew the letter of the law, and more importantly, the spirit of community rights. "These fines are baseless," he countered, his tone laced with both authority and exasperation. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the zoning office. This is nothing short of extortion." Within hours, the situation escalated. Inspectors from the local building department began arriving at Ethan's home, their clipboards in hand, scrutinizing every inch of the property. Each visit was more invasive than the last, and whispers began circulating among neighbors about the mounting pressure on Ethan. It wasn't long before anonymous tips reached the city council, spurred by Kerren's relentless campaign to discredit him. At one point, while Ethan was working on restoring the frame of his classic car, he was interrupted by a stern inspector asking pointed questions about his property's compliance with local codes. "I don't see any structural issues," Ethan argued, but the inspector's eyes were cold and unyielding. The visit ended with a curt warning that any further noncompliance could result in even heavier fines. Back at the HOA office, Kerren relished the unfolding drama. She reviewed her checklist, a smug smile playing at her lips as she cross-referenced every minor detail that could be twisted into a violation. To her, this was a triumph of authority, a demonstration that her power was unquestionable. "This is just the beginning, Ethan," she murmured under her breath, convinced that every infraction, no matter how trivial, was proof of his disregard for community standards. Ethan, on the other hand, spent that turbulent afternoon poring over local ordinances and legal precedents. His experience as a city official provided him with the confidence and insight needed to challenge the HOA's overreach. With documents spread across his dining table, he carefully annotated each clause that supported his right to maintain his property as he saw fit. "They're trying to bully me with rules that don't even apply," he muttered, frustration intermingling with his steely resolve. In a show of defiance, Ethan decided to take the matter public. He posted a detailed account of the fine and the intrusive inspections on a local online forum, a space where fellow homeowners often exchange stories of similar encounters with the HOA. Within hours, his story went viral in the neighborhood, sparking debates and drawing a crowd of supporters who were tired of arbitrary regulations. The digital outcry forced even some of the HOA board members to question Kerren's motives, though they remained too fearful of her iron fist to speak out openly. That evening, as the sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and red, Ethan sat on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee, contemplating his next move. The fine, the inspections, and Kerren's relentless smirk were all part of a calculated power move meant to break his spirit. Instead, it had galvanized him. "I won't be bullied into silence," he resolved quietly, his mind already devising a counter-strategy that would expose the absurdity of the HOA's actions once and for all. Meanwhile, Kerren returned to her meticulously organized home office, where she meticulously documented every interaction and filed away copies of the citations. She believed that every infraction, however minor, was evidence of Ethan's noncompliance. In her mind, the community would eventually fall in line, and any dissent would be crushed beneath the weight of her bureaucratic authority. Thus, the first power move by the HOA had been set in motion, a calculated assault on Ethan's independence using fines, legal threats, and intrusive inspections. Both sides had now committed to a battle of wills that promised to draw in the entire community. The stage was set for a conflict that would escalate beyond parking violations and fines, a war between personal freedom and the oppressive demands of entitlement. As the days passed, the intensity of the conflict only grew. Ethan began noticing a disturbing pattern. Neighbors, once reticent and complacent, were whispering about secret donations to the HOA fund that coincided with the sudden disappearance of fines levied against other homeowners. In hushed conversations over backyard fences, residents mentioned how Kerren's hand seemed to guide every decision, regardless of its fairness or legality. Determined to understand the underlying corruption, Ethan embarked on a thorough investigation of the HOA's operations. Late one evening, while reviewing public records in his home office, he discovered irregularities in the association's financial statements. Certain funds meant for community improvements appeared to have been siphoned off into mysterious accounts. A slip of a number here, a misfiled receipt there. Each detail reinforced his suspicion that Kerren was abusing her power. At a neighborhood barbecue that weekend, Ethan casually approached an elderly resident known for her discreet observations. "I've noticed some strange discrepancies in the HOA records," he confided in a low voice, his eyes scanning the crowd. The resident hesitated before admitting, "Kerren's always been a bit extravagant. I wouldn't be surprised if she's using our money for personal gains." That single remark ignited a flame of determination in Ethan. He knew that proving corruption would be the key to turning the tide. Over the following week, Ethan set up small cameras in discreet locations around his property. His goal was not only to protect his own rights, but also to gather undeniable evidence of the HOA's misdeeds. Each day, he recorded snippets of conversations, clandestine meetings between board members, and even Kerren's late-night trips to her car. The evidence was mounting. A particularly damning moment came when one board member, clearly troubled by Kerren's decisions, discreetly approached Ethan in the neighborhood park. "There's something off about the way she's running things," the board member confided. "I've seen documents that suggest funds have been diverted for personal use." With this insider tip, Ethan realized he was not alone in his fight. Armed with proof and bolstered by the support of disillusioned neighbors, Ethan began planning a counterattack. He compiled photographs, video clips, and copies of financial documents into a comprehensive dossier. His intention was to confront the HOA at the next board meeting, exposing not only the baseless fines, but also the deeper corruption that had poisoned the community. Each piece of evidence was like a bullet in his quiver, a means to challenge the narrative Kerren had so carefully constructed. Kerren, however, was not blind to the gathering storm. In her polished office, she scrolled through social media updates and read heated comments from disgruntled residents. The more she tried to justify her actions by citing obscure clauses in the HOA handbook, the louder the collective outcry became. Even a few of her once loyal board members began to voice concerns privately. Yet, when confronted publicly, they hesitated, trapped between loyalty to Kerren and fear of retribution. The next HOA board meeting was set to be a battleground. In the grand, sterile meeting room of the community center, residents gathered with palpable tension in the air. Kerren arrived with a confidence that masked her inner anxiety, while Ethan entered quietly, his dossier tucked under his arm. The meeting began with the customary recitations of community rules and reminders about the importance of order. But it wasn't long before Ethan's voice cut through the formality. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the assembled homeowners with a calm intensity, "we are not here merely to debate petty fines. I have uncovered evidence that our association's funds have been misused, and that some among us have been complicit in turning a blind eye to corruption." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some residents exchanged looks of relief, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kerren's face flushed as she attempted to regain control. "This is preposterous," she spat. "You're fabricating stories to undermine the rules that keep our community safe." But as Ethan methodically laid out his findings, displaying documents that contradicted the very rules she so passionately enforced, skepticism turned to outrage among many attendees. The board members, sensing the shifting tide, began to murmur among themselves. Some even questioned whether Kerren's previous decisions had been legally sound. With each piece of evidence, Ethan chipped away at the foundation of Kerren's authority. The once unchallenged enforcer of community standards was now exposed as someone willing to abuse her power for personal gain. As the meeting ended in a chaotic flurry of voices and demands for accountability, Ethan knew the battle had reached a turning point. The HOA's escalating tactics had sown enough doubt to galvanize the community into action, and his carefully gathered dossier was about to become the catalyst for a revolution in neighborhood governance. The weekend after the explosive board meeting began with a shock that left Ethan reeling. In the dim light of early dawn, he awoke to the sound of heavy machinery tearing into the familiar contours of his property. Rushing outside, he discovered that his driveway was being aggressively excavated. Concrete was being dug up, and a maze of new, temporary paths snaked across his once pristine lawn. A foreman in a neon vest approached him, clipboard clutched tightly in hand. "We're expanding sidewalks, sir. It's all in accordance with the new HOA directive," he explained in a monotone voice that offered little comfort. Ethan's first instinct was disbelief. This was not a planned renovation, nor a consensual community improvement. It was an unauthorized overstep. "This isn't on my property," he roared, drawing the attention of curious neighbors. "Who authorized this work?" His demand for accountability was met with silence, except for the foreman's measured reply. "Orders are orders, sir." Frustrated but determined, Ethan marched back inside to review his dossier. With the neighborhood now witnessing the breach of his property rights, he realized that Kerren had resorted to extreme measures to regain control. She had escalated from fines and intrusive inspections to physically altering homeowners' landscapes. It was clear. The HOA's actions were no longer about maintaining standards, but about enforcing obedience through intimidation. That afternoon, armed with irrefutable legal documents and detailed photographs of the chaos in his yard, Ethan made his way to the community center for another impromptu meeting. The room, filled with anxious homeowners, buzzed with a mix of anger and disbelief. As Ethan connected his laptop to a projector, he began outlining the latest transgression. "This is not a community improvement," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "This is a deliberate violation of my property rights. And it's only the beginning." As he displayed side-by-side images of his undisturbed property from weeks before and its current state, a palpable shift occurred among the attendees. The crowd's murmur grew into determined chatter, with residents recounting similar stories of overreach by the HOA. Some recalled receiving unexpected notices about temporary construction in their own yards. Others had experienced sudden visits from contractors with no identification. It was a pattern of systematic abuse of power. Amid the growing chorus of dissent, Ethan laid out his plan. "I propose we document every single act of overreach," he urged. "Let's gather evidence and demand accountability from the HOA board. We have legal rights, and we can fight back as a united community." The reaction was swift. Small groups of neighbors formed, each vowing to monitor their properties and report any anomalies. The seeds of resistance were now firmly planted. Kerren, ever the iron-fisted manager, attempted to regain control of the narrative. At a hastily convened emergency HOA meeting, she brandished a file of complaints and insisted that all actions were conducted in strict accordance with the association's guidelines. "If you cannot abide by the rules, then perhaps you should reconsider living in a community that values order above all else," she declared, her voice rising in a mix of indignation and desperation. But the tide had already turned. Bolstered by Ethan's evidence and the solidarity of their neighbors, several board members began to question the legitimacy of Kerren's orders. One even challenged her in a low, steady tone. "What happens when the law contradicts these guidelines?" His question, though softly spoken, reverberated in the tense silence of the meeting room. Outside, as dusk fell over the neighborhood, Ethan took a solitary walk around his property, reflecting on the day's events. The physical destruction of his driveway was more than just a violation. It was a symbol of the HOA's willingness to use brute force to quash dissent. In that moment, he resolved that the final act of this battle was drawing near. His counterattack would not only reclaim his property, but would force the HOA to answer for its blatant disregard for individual rights. As the night deepened, Ethan returned home and carefully secured his garage door. The memory of Kerren's smug assurances and the invasive construction still haunted him, but his resolve was unshaken. In the war between authoritarian bureaucracy and personal freedom, he knew that a single, determined voice could spark a revolution, and he was prepared to be that voice. In the days following Ethan's passionate stand, Kerren grew increasingly desperate. No longer content with fines, inspections, and unauthorized construction, she escalated her tactics to a level that bordered on the absurd. One early morning, as the neighborhood was still quiet and sleep lingered in the air, Kerren made a move that would mark the nadir of her overreach. It began with a call to the local police. Kerren, armed with a self-righteous conviction, dialed the emergency number and reported that Ethan's porch lights were creating a public disturbance. In her distorted logic, the flashing of a few extra lumens on his cherished porch was a menace to the neighborhood's aesthetic order. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars cruised up the street, their lights painting the facades of homes with blue flashes. When the officers arrived at Ethan's property, he greeted them with a calm yet assertive manner befitting his role as a city official. Flashing his badge, he explained, "My porch lights are fully compliant with local regulations. I suggest you verify the codes before issuing any further citations." The officers exchanged wary glances as they explained that they had received a complaint. As they left, Ethan couldn't help but shake his head. "This is getting out of hand," he murmured. But Kerren wasn't finished. Not one to accept defeat, she escalated her next move by hiring a private investigator to dig up dirt on him. A final, desperate bid to undermine his credibility. Late one night, while reviewing security footage in his garage, Ethan noticed something alarming. A shadowy figure, clearly not one of his usual visitors, was creeping around his property. Reviewing the footage frame by frame, he identified the intruder. It was the very private investigator Kerren had hired. The man was seen lingering near the garage door, even attempting to peer through the window. In that moment, Ethan knew that Kerren had crossed an illegal line. Determined to expose this invasion of privacy, Ethan contacted an old friend from the Department of Public Safety, who helped him retrieve the full footage and securely store the evidence. The following week, at the next HOA meeting, Ethan arrived armed with indisputable proof of Kerren's underhanded tactics. As the gathered residents listened, he played the video clip on a large screen. The room fell silent as they watched the footage. The investigator's furtive movements, his suspicious glances at the security camera, and the clear violation of Ethan's privacy. Gasps filled the room. For the first time, many were confronted with the tangible evidence of Kerren's desperation. "You see this," Ethan declared, his voice echoing in the hush. "This isn't about a few extra lumens or harmless community rules. It's about intimidation, violation of privacy, and outright abuse of power. Kerren is no longer enforcing standards. She's terrorizing us." The evidence was undeniable, and the crowd's reaction was immediate. Faces that had once been neutral now wore expressions of shock and indignation. In the ensuing chaos, Kerren attempted to salvage the situation. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted, her voice faltering as she tried to regain control of the narrative. "I was only trying to maintain the order of our community." But her words fell on deaf ears. The residents, emboldened by Ethan's clear demonstration of injustice, began questioning her authority openly. A flurry of murmurs and whispered agreements rippled through the crowd. One resident shouted, "How can we trust someone who resorts to hiring spies and calling in the cops for nothing?" Another demanded, "When will we put an end to this tyranny?" Kerren's face turned pale as she struggled to muster a defense. In her desperation, she even tried to point to a convoluted clause in the HOA bylaws, but it was too late. The moment had passed. Her actions had exposed her for what they were, a final, desperate attempt to cling to power. Defeated and increasingly isolated, Kerren retreated from the public eye as the meeting ended in a cacophony of angry voices and demands for accountability. Ethan's evidence, collected through days of careful observation and steadfast determination, had now become a weapon against tyranny. And as the residents left the community center that evening, united in their demand for justice, it was clear that Kerren's days of unchecked power were numbered. In the wake of Kerren's latest debacle, the balance of power in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. The explosive revelations at the HOA meeting had sent shockwaves through the community. No longer willing to tolerate her iron-fisted rule, the residents banded together in a show of unity that the HOA board could no longer ignore. Within days, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. Heated discussions in driveways and late-night gatherings in backyards gave way to a clear, resolute message. Kerren's regime was over. A special meeting was convened, one that was uncharacteristically attended by nearly every homeowner in the area. The agenda was singular and unambiguous: the removal of Kerren from her self-appointed position of power. At the meeting, Ethan was invited to speak once again. Standing at the podium, he recounted the sequence of abuses, from the unwarranted fines to the illegal construction on his property, culminating in the damning security footage that revealed Kerren's desperate measures. His voice, steady and impassioned, filled the room with a sense of shared purpose. For too long, we have lived under the shadow of arbitrary rules and unchecked authority, he declared. Today we reclaim our neighborhood and our rights. The vote that followed was swift and decisive. One by one, residents cast their ballots in a dramatic, almost cathartic fashion. When the final count was read, it was clear: Kerren had been removed from the HOA board. In a final twist of poetic justice, the community decided that the entire structure of the HOA would be overhauled, a move that would render the current system of fines and intrusions obsolete. In the days that followed, the change was palpable. City officials, spurred by the outcry and mounting evidence of corruption, launched an investigation into the HOA's practices. The once proud institution began to crumble under the weight of legal scrutiny. Neighbors who had once been silent in the face of overreach now spoke freely, sharing stories of how fines were mysteriously rescinded if homeowners donated to a secret fund. Public records revealed a trail of questionable financial transactions that implicated not only Kerren, but several board members. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. While he savored the moment of retribution as Kerren's grip on the community loosened, he knew that the battle for true justice was far from over. He spent long evenings poring over legal documents, coordinating with fellow residents to file a class action lawsuit against the corrupt HOA. "This isn't just about me," he told a small group of supporters. "It's about every single homeowner who was bullied into silence. We're fighting for our right to live in a community free from tyranny." As the legal process unfolded, Kerren's personal life began to unravel. The media, having caught wind of the scandal, portrayed her as the emblem of overreach and entitlement. Local news segments detailed the financial irregularities, the mounting fines, and the public's growing disdain. Her once pristine home became a symbol of disgrace, an icon of what happens when power is abused. One morning, as Kerren struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy, a knock at the door revealed a package. Inside was a notice from the bank. Her car had been repossessed, a final blow to her carefully constructed image of success. The community, united in purpose, watched as Kerren's authority crumbled piece by piece. In one final dramatic act of retribution, Ethan arrived at the next community gathering with a fresh cup of coffee and a serene smile on his face, a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded. "Justice isn't served in grand gestures," he remarked to a supportive neighbor, "but in the everyday stand we take for our rights." His words resonated deeply, a fitting epitaph for the end of an era of tyranny. In the weeks following Kerren's public downfall, the legal repercussions for the HOA began to mount. City officials, now armed with extensive evidence of systemic corruption, moved decisively. A formal investigation was launched, and soon the HOA was slapped with hefty fines for violating numerous local ordinances. The community's long-ignored grievances were finally given the attention they deserved. At a subsequent public hearing, Ethan stood before a panel of city inspectors and legal authorities. With his dossier in hand, he recounted the series of abuses, from the unauthorized construction on his property to the unlawful use of fines as a tool of intimidation. This is not merely a case of misguided enforcement, he argued, but a clear violation of our rights as homeowners. His testimony was supported by multiple residents who testified about their own experiences, painting a damning portrait of the HOA's practices. The hearing ended with a unanimous decision. The HOA would be dissolved, its funds frozen pending a full audit, and several board members, Kerren included, were to face legal charges for fraud, extortion, and abuse of power. As the news spread, the community felt a cathartic release. The institution that had long been a symbol of oppression was now held accountable, and the residents were finally free to govern themselves in a fairer, more transparent manner. Ethan's final act of defiance in this chapter came when he personally submitted the class action lawsuit on behalf of the homeowners. His meticulous work and unwavering resolve had not only dismantled the corrupt system, but it also set a precedent for civic engagement and accountability in the community. "Let this be a reminder," he said during a press conference, "that no institution is above the law, and no one's voice should ever be silenced." In the weeks following Kerren's public downfall, the legal repercussions for the HOA began to mount. City officials, now armed with extensive evidence of systemic corruption, moved decisively. A formal investigation was launched, and soon, the HOA was slapped with hefty fines for violating numerous local ordinances. The community's long-ignored grievances were finally given the attention they deserved. At a subsequent public hearing, Ethan stood before a panel of city inspectors and legal authorities. With his dossier in hand, he recounted the series of abuses, from the unauthorized construction on his property to the unlawful use of fines as a tool of intimidation. This is not merely a case of misguided enforcement, he argued, but a clear violation of our rights as homeowners. His testimony was supported by multiple residents who testified about their own experiences, painting a damning portrait of the HOA's practices. The hearing ended with a unanimous decision. The HOA would be dissolved, its funds frozen pending a full audit, and several board members, Kerren included, were to face legal charges for fraud, extortion, and abuse of power. As the news spread, the community felt a cathartic release. The institution that had long been a symbol of oppression was now held accountable, and the residents were finally free to govern themselves in a fairer, more transparent manner. Ethan's final act of defiance in this chapter came when he personally submitted the class action lawsuit on behalf of the homeowners. His meticulous work and unwavering resolve had not only dismantled the corrupt system, but it also set a precedent for civic engagement and accountability in the community. "Let this be a reminder," he said during a press conference, "that no institution is above the law, and no one's voice should ever be silenced." Months later, the neighborhood had transformed. The oppressive atmosphere that once hung over the cul-de-sac had given way to a renewed sense of freedom and community spirit. Neighbors gathered regularly, not to discuss fines or violations, but to share laughter, stories, and the simple pleasure of living without fear of arbitrary rules. Ethan, now regarded as a local hero, spent his evenings on his porch, the glow of his compliant yet warmly lit lights a symbol of his hard-won victory. As he sipped his coffee, familiar faces drifted by, exchanging smiles and friendly greetings. The scars of the past were slowly healing, replaced by a cautious optimism for a future built on transparency and mutual respect. One evening, as a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak in his yard, a neighbor approached him with a wry grin. "I just got an HOA notice for having too many birds in my yard," they joked, a light-hearted jab at a system now relic of a bygone era. Ethan laughed, a deep, genuine sound that echoed through the quiet street. "They really tried, didn't they?" he replied, his tone carrying the wisdom of hard-fought battles. The final mic drop came unexpectedly. At a community celebration marking the anniversary of the HOA's dissolution, a local journalist asked Ethan about the entire ordeal. He simply smiled, leaned forward, and said, "When entitlement tries to dictate our lives, the only answer is to lock the door, and sometimes you just have to walk away for a while." The remark, both humorous and deeply resonant, encapsulated the spirit of the neighborhood's victory over bureaucratic tyranny. As the celebration wound down and the last of the guests departed, Ethan lingered on his porch, savoring the silence and the triumph that came from standing up for one's rights. In that peaceful moment, it was clear. The community had not only reclaimed its physical space, but had also restored the dignity and autonomy that every homeowner deserved. Fade to black.